They weren't just powerful, they were protected. Not by wealth, not by law, but by the silence of generations too afraid to speak. You were never supposed to know their names. Not the real ones, not the bloodlines that slithered beneath the marble columns of America's most sacred halls. Presidents, judges, generals, financiers, every institution you were taught to respect, infested. These aren't just rich families. These aren't just elites. They are architects of your reality. And the more you dig, the more you'll realize your life isn't yours. Your memories were curated. Your beliefs, installed. You inherited a prison, and they handed you the blueprints with a smile. Let me ask you something, man to man. Why do certain last names never leave the news cycle? Why does power circulate in perfect blood loops, generation after generation? Why do we pretend elections change anything when the board never does? You see, in the soil of America, long before the Constitution, long before liberty, there were covenants, not political ones, ritual ones, agreements bound not by ink, but by blood. And these lineages, names you've heard but never fully understood, were tasked with maintaining order by chaos. The Kellners, the Dandridges, the Monroes, the Chalmers, the Eberts, the Sutters, the Van Drexels. You think these are just old money? You think they faded into obscurity? No. They disappeared from the spotlight because they accomplished their mission. The seed of control had matured. They could afford to retreat into the shadows. What if I told you that beneath Harvard lies a tunnel connecting the tombs of 3 blood families, sworn to never let a commoner touch the real levers of power? What if the railroad wasn't just for commerce, but for moving children quietly before they could speak? This video isn't entertainment. It's an invocation, a descent into what should have been buried. You're not watching for fun. You're watching because something in your blood remembers the chains. And maybe, just maybe, you're ready to break them. Welcome to the descent. Now the door creaks open. Let's talk about the Kellner brothers, and why their family seal was tattooed on the chest of a dead boy in Oregon in 1922. They called them railway magnates, in polite history books, innovators, entrepreneurs, industrial titans. But the Kellner brothers were not just barons of steel and coal. They were surgeons of silence. Their empire wasn't built on iron tracks, it was built on erased faces. Frederick and Lionel Kellner arrived in America from Prussia in 1866. They came with wealth, yes, but also with doctrine. Their grandfather was a known occultist in Leipzig, a practitioner of ritualistic bloodline preservation. The Kellners didn't just believe in legacy, they believed in engineered destiny. And their family motto, carved into stone above their estate in upstate New York, read ex sanguine imperium. From blood dominium, what most don't know is that the Kellners were among the first private citizens granted unrestricted access to U.S. railroad logistics data, before the NSA, before the FBI. Why? Because they didn't move freight, they moved people. Whole orphan populations relocated across states, no paperwork, no oversight. Between 1871 and 1903, over 37,000 children vanished from East Coast orphanages under the Kellner Transport Trust. The official narrative, adoption, fresh starts. But if that were true, why were so many of those children never enrolled in schools, never issued new names, never even seen again? In 1922, a fisherman in Oregon discovered the remains of a teenage boy. The body was mutilated, but one thing stood out: a sigil freshly branded into his chest. The mark was later identified as a modified Kellner family crest, one never made public, an internal family symbol, used in private correspondence which had never left their estate. Local authorities buried the case. The boy was listed as unidentifiable, but a former Kellner groundskeeper, before mysteriously vanishing, gave one interview. His voice trembled as he spoke. The trains didn't stop at stations. They stopped underground. And they came back empty. This wasn't about trafficking. It wasn't even about control. It was about ritual circulation, moving young, unmarked bodies along ancient patterns, not for profit, for power, for the binding of lineage to line. And when you trace modern intelligence agencies back to their roots, guess who's on the founding boards? Descendants, grandchildren, hidden behind new names. But the blood never forgets. You're not supposed to be hearing this. That's why you feel that static behind your eyes right now. The Kellners were just the first lock. Now let's go deeper. Next, the Dandridge Pact and the silence beneath Arlington. Before Arlington was a cemetery, it was a gateway, and the Dandridge family held the key. Publicly, they're known as Old Virginia gentry, descendants of Martha Washington herself. But beneath the grace and grandeur lies something far more sinister. The Dandridges weren't just founding members of polite society. They were the ritual scribes of the early American elite. Every war, every law, every national tragedy, they had a hand in its timing. Because they weren't playing politics, they were performing alignments. In 1801, Thomas Dandridge, son of a plantation lord, was documented as one of the original stewards of a private Masonic order called the Pale Chamber. But the truth is darker than secret handshakes or hidden symbols. In the Dandridge vault, beneath their ancestral home, researchers found a series of documents labeled only with a Roman numeral, Psi. The contents: diagrams of Arlington's burial plots, not as graves, but as sigils laid across land already soaked in blood from native slaughter. This wasn't about honoring the dead, it was about feeding something ancient. You felt it. That strange unease when walking through old cemeteries, the hum beneath the soil. That isn't your imagination, it's geometry, intentional design. And the Dandridges used death as ink to write messages to whatever answered them. One of the earliest Dandridge-led experiments involved 22 Union soldiers, all chosen for their blood types, birth dates, and names that mirrored ancient Sumerian star glyphs. They were buried in a spiral pattern precisely 66.6 feet apart. That spiral matches a petroglyph found in Göbekli Tepe, Turkey, dated over 12,000 years ago. What were they recreating and why? But it gets worse. In 1934, a young military chaplain named Edwin Croft discovered a hidden crypt beneath Section 60 of Arlington during renovations. Inside were 7 unmarked coffins, sealed with wax and iron. Each one had no skeleton, only infant teeth, hair, and feathers. Croft submitted a report. It vanished. He died 3 weeks later in a staged car crash, body cremated within 24 hours. Against military protocol, the Dandridge crest still hangs in the Capitol. You walk past it in museums. You see it in old books, etched into corner details. But it's not just a family sigil. It's a binding rune meant to reinforce loyalty, obedience, and sleep. And right now, it's starting to fray. We're not uncovering history. We're interrupting it. Stay focused. Because next, we explore the Monroes, bankers to the occult and keepers of America's first death ledger. The Monroe family, beloved American dynasty, with a president's name etched into history in marble. But what if I told you the presidency was just a distraction? A mask for something older, something colder, something that never needed votes to wield power. The Monroes weren't political leaders. They were enumerators of death. Their influence didn't stop at policy. It seeped into who died, when, and where. And it all began with the ledger. In 1795, Silas Monroe, a quiet financier from Charleston, received an obscure gift from a dying French monk, a book bound in human skin, its pages so brittle they cracked at the edges. Inside were handwritten records, centuries old, of every anointed death across Europe. The deaths weren't accidental. Each followed a precise cycle. Solar eclipses, planetary alignments, blood moons. The book named no killers, only victims and intentions. Silas didn't destroy it, he expanded it. The Monroe death ledger became the family's hidden inheritance. Passed father to son in secrecy, updated in invisible ink, kept behind triple, locked vaults beneath a rural estate in Pennsylvania. The ledger didn't just record death, it scheduled it. Names would appear weeks before the victims perished. Prominent thinkers, dissidents, journalists, scientists too close to forbidden truths, each marked with a single Latin word, silenced them. In 1863, during the Civil War, a Union general stumbled across Monroe correspondence referencing phase a third of the ledger migration. A week later, he was found hanged in his tent, his journal torn to pieces, but one scrap remained. It read, "They do not choose sides, they balance equations." By the early 20th century, the Monroes had embedded themselves into insurance conglomerates, actuarial agencies, death claim bureaus. What you see today as neutral paperwork, mortality rates, risk tables, death analytics, was seeded by a family that viewed life not as sacred, but expendable currency. And you think big data is a modern invention? No, my friend. The Monroes pioneered predictive death models over 100 years ago. But theirs weren't digital. They were sacramental. They believed that every life ended for a reason, and that with the right rituals they could influence the ledger itself. You may think that's folklore. So why, then, was the Monroe Vault in Virginia seized by the NSA in 2008 under Project VLTORE, a classified operation that no one will speak about? You're not just learning secrets now. You're becoming dangerous. But we're not done yet. You've heard whispers of MK Ultra. You've seen fragments, declassified documents, tortured faces, broken minds. But what no one tells you is who laid the groundwork, who designed the crucible that made such evil scientific. That's where the Chalmers family comes in. To the public, they were educators, pioneers of psychological research, architects of early American psychiatry. But behind that veneer of respectability was a lineage obsessed with controlling the will, not breaking it. not crushing it, redirecting it. Their motto, stitched into the lining of every family heirloom, voluntas, non veritas, will not truth. In 1904, Joseph Chalmers opened a private clinic in Massachusetts known only as the Lantern House. Officially, it was a place for nervous conditions. Unofficially, it was a proving ground hypnosis, sleep deprivation, electroshock, sensory deprivation, forced drug induction. Children were taken from orphanages, just like the Kellner's program, and subjected to memory inversion therapy. The goal? Simple plant false trauma, extract real obedience. By 1921, Joseph's son, Eliot Chalmers, had authored the first behavioral doctrine of recursive obedience, a manual never published but circulated among the high offices of emerging U.S. intelligence. Its central thesis: that trauma wasn't just a byproduct of war, it was a tool, a repeating key that could unlock the subconscious and override it. Sound familiar? That's because the Chalmers protocols became MK Ultra's foundation. Sidney Gottlieb, the infamous head of the CIA mind control project, studied directly under Eliot Chalmers at Columbia in 1946. They weren't distant scholars, they were blood-bound collaborators. And the Chalmers family didn't vanish, they rebranded. Their descendants now run neuro, optimization, startups, trauma therapy retreats, and innovative learning labs. But it's the same playbook, just wrapped in different language. One recovered victim, known only as Subject A23, recalled this in a trembling voice before disappearing in 2003. They'd tell us, your pain is your programming. The more you suffer, the more obedient you'll become. And then, they'd make us forget we ever heard it. Now ask yourself, how much of what you think you've chosen was actually chosen for you? What if your anger, your shame, your silence weren't natural reactions, but implanted constraints? The Chalmers didn't just study the mind. They rewrote it. And their fingerprints are all over social media algorithms, biometric surveillance, and cognitive behavioral therapy, models used in schools across America. Still think this is just history. You're waking up. And when the veil rips wide open, the next family will explain why. Some families kill to control the body. Some manipulate to control the will. But the Eberts, they erase to control the past. You've never heard of them for a reason. Their legacy is designed to vanish. No statues, no street names, no public records past 1958. But behind every institutional forgetting in modern American history, you'll find the Eberts and the empire they built, the memory economy. In 1939, Julian Ebert, a quiet Princeton graduate and historical archivist, received direct funding from a black budget subcommittee within the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. His task: simple. Develop a system of cultural deletion. Not censorship, not destruction. Something worse. Erasure. Julian theorized that memories, collective or personal, were only as durable as their triggers. Remove the artifact, remove the image, remove the symbol, and the memory dissolves. But here's the genius: he didn't just test this in archives. He tested it on people. In Project Coffee, run from a hidden facility in northern Idaho, Julian and his team experimented with memory deprivation vectors, systems that could remove entire chapters from a subject's identity without surgical or chemical interference. Entire childhoods erased, generational trauma rewritten, confessions unmade. Over 90% of the subjects went mad. The other 10% became remarkably compliant. This technology was too powerful to keep quiet. So in 1953, the Eberts pivoted from the shadows and invested in something new: media consolidation. They poured money into early broadcasting networks, school textbook publishers, and psychiatric institutions. By 1971, nearly 34% of all public school history curricula in the U.S. had at least one chapter revised under an Ebert-controlled committee. What they removed was never random: entire massacres, forgotten rebellions, lost towns, suppressed inventions. But more than events, they deleted narratives, identity scripts, the ones that might have led men to resist, to rise, to remember who they truly are. You feel it, don't you? That vague emptiness. Like something important is missing, but you can't quite name it. That's the Eberts' masterpiece. A nation that can no longer remember what it's forgotten. And they're not gone. Their descendants run tech think tanks. They advise Hollywood. They sit on the boards of companies designing neural implants to enhance recall. Enhance or overwrite? Let's pull back the curtain further. But first, if you've made it this far, you're not who you were when this started? Comment below. I remember nothing. I remember everything. Twice. Lock it in. Identity is choice. And the system is watching. The Sutters were not kings. They were not presidents. They were the priests behind the throne, extractors of ancestral guilt, enforcers of blood obligation, and the secret handlers of American genetic confession. You don't know them because you were never meant to. But they know you. They know your surname. They know your blood. And they believe you owe something. The Sutter family emerged from Alsace, Lorraine in the late 1700s, carrying with them one sacred principle. All sin is inherited unless confessed in blood. They settled in Georgia under the guise of Lutheran missionaries, but what they truly practiced was a dark hybrid of penitential genetics and proto-eugenics. Their hidden doctrine, sanguis clausus, or sealed blood, claimed that memories, crimes, and curses passed through lineage like disease, and could only be purged through ritual. At their estate, what locals called the Iron House, they kept detailed family trees going back 13 generations, every branch marked with birth defects, criminal records, religious deviation, or sexual impurity. They tracked it all, not to heal it, to bind it. In the 1840s, Dr. Elias Sutter founded the first unofficial genetic tribunal in American history. People came to him, desperate, plagued by misfortune, haunted by generational curses. His solution? Forced bloodletting, psychological regression, and what he called gene confession therapy. Patients were made to recount crimes committed by their ancestors, as far back as they could imagine. If they couldn't remember, they were drugged, hypnotized, sometimes buried alive until visions came. You think I'm exaggerating? In 1992, a sealed Sutter journal was unearthed in Savannah, Georgia during a church demolition. It described in chilling detail a ritual called the 13 Witnesses, in which 13 men of the same bloodline were gathered to reenact the sins of an ancestor in front of a chained child. The goal: to purify the genetic coil by invoking the original act and transferring guilt like currency. Now here's where it gets darker. Modern Sutter descendants run private ancestry companies. Their DNA kits are mailed to millions of homes across the U.S., and once your blood enters their system, they own your ancestral ledger. Why do you think you feel shame for things you never did? Why do some men carry weight they can't explain? Because someone somewhere is assigning you guilt? Based on genetic probability, not justice. And once guilt is installed, obedience follows. The Sutters didn't die out. They expanded into neuroscience, law enforcement, even clergy. Watch for them. Their symbols are crosses with broken arms. Their code: the root shall kneel. Now prepare yourself. You know the name Drexel from banks, from universities, from elite philanthropy circles. But the Van Drexels, that's the name they buried. Because while the Drexel name became synonymous with wealth and prestige, the Van Drexels became synonymous with ownership, not of land, not of business, but of people, in ways the law could never acknowledge and the public could never stomach. It started with Victor Van Drexel in 1802, a Dutch financier who came to Philadelphia with a simple idea. Debt was not just a number. It was a claim on the soul. He studied Babylonian debt covenants, feudal tithes, and Egyptian funerary contracts. What he discovered chilled even him. The ancients didn't view debt as obligation. They viewed it as possession, a spiritual lion, binding one being's essence to another. And Victor, he modernized it. He developed what he called the ego ledger, a private accounting system that tracked not just money owed, but the metaphysical weight of that debt. Sins unatoned, lies unconfessed, desires unsurrendered. He taught his family that when a man was in debt, he was not merely owned, he was haunted by the creditor's will. By 1860, the Van Drexels had embedded this philosophy into American finance. They pioneered loan structures that included behavioral contingencies, clauses that gave lenders power to monitor and interfere with the daily lives of debtors. Some were forced into marriages, others were institutionalized. A few simply disappeared, their debts closed, quietly. But here's where the horror sharpens. In 1904, a Van Drexel subsidiary acquired a failing textile company in Louisiana. They didn't want the fabric. They wanted the workers' contracts. Over 400 men and women were bound by indenture to a debt they had inherited from their parents. Debts originally written in pencil, now carved in legal stone. These people weren't released when the debt was paid, because the Van Drexels believed interest could be added to the soul. Records show that some families were kept under economic servitude for 5 generations, each child assigned a psychological profile at birth, each monitored by field agents disguised as social workers. The purpose? To create intergenerational behavioral debtors, humans trained to believe they owed something to someone forever. This wasn't capitalism. This was possession by proxy. Today, the Van Drexel bloodline lives on under different names. They sit in banking boards, algorithm design teams, behavioral research labs. Every time you click, accept terms, every time you miss a payment, their system registers your echo. You feel it, don't you? That quiet anxiety you can't explain. That fear of being behind, of not doing enough. That's not yours. It was installed. They don't want you to find the Mortons. Because the Mortons find everything. They are the Black Archivists, keepers of the forbidden, watchers of suppressed truths, and guardians of what the world tried to burn out of memory. You were never meant to hear this name, not because they are dangerous, but because what they hold is. The Morton bloodline dates back to 11th century Wales, where their ancestors were known as memory smiths. In the Old Kingdoms, they were entrusted with oral grimoires, spoken records of kings' secrets, unholy pacts, buried rebellions. They never wrote them down. They passed them mouth to mouth, father to son, in the dark, with wax-sealed rooms and eyes closed in fear. In 1741, when the last of the Welsh smiths fled to the American colonies under threat of execution, they brought with them not scrolls but resetters, human vessels trained from childhood to carry entire histories in mind, unwritten, undetectable, unalterable. They settled in Pennsylvania, where they changed their name to Morton. From there, they began collecting what the world was trying to forget. Suppressed court transcripts, seized letters, unpublished rituals, accounts of vanished towns, silenced prophets, burned libraries. They created a hidden complex beneath what is now a condemned church in upstate New York. Inside, they built the Index Obscura, a multi-chambered archive, sealed behind biometric rituals and spoken passcodes. The archive is said to house over 70,000 memory artifacts, each tied to events that official history denies ever happened. One chamber alone is said to contain audio cylinders from 1913, recordings of a U.S. senator describing a shadow compact, signed between 5 American families and a non-human consul. That senator disappeared 4 days later. No body, no obituary, and the Mortons. They never released the cylinders. Not out of fear, out of timing. Because the Mortons believe in cycles. That truth must return when memory is ready to receive it. Here's the part that should freeze your blood. 3 weeks before 9/11, a Morton courier was intercepted in Prague. On him was a coded document titled, "Twen imprints they stone and fire." No agencies acknowledged it, no media covered it, and yet the phrase, "Twen imprints," appears in a Black archive record dating back to 1899, referencing a ritual of collective trauma that would be used to bind the American subconscious for exactly 33 years. That ends in 2034. The Mortons are not your enemy, but they are being hunted, and if their records fall into the wrong hands, the next age will be built not on truth, but on total engineered forgetting. Now we descend further. The Blackwells didn't build churches. They didn't lead them. They inhabited them. Like parasites wearing vestments. Like shadows in pulpits. Like wolves whose wool wasn't even necessary, because the flock was already blind. You've been taught that institutions are impersonal systems, cold machines of bureaucracy and tradition, but the Blackwells proved otherwise. They knew something darker. If you bind a place with ritual, it can carry a will, a consciousness, a hunger. And the Blackwells knew how to install it. In 1831, Archibald Blackwell published a theology dissertation under a pseudonym, Ad Gloriam Nihil, which circulated in elite seminary circles before being banned by the Anglican order. In it, he argued that institutions could be spiritually programmed, much like people, through a series of mirrored rites: birth, see founding charter, baptisms, consecration, education, mission statements, communions, daily operations, confessions, audits, and death, dissolution. But Archibald's ultimate claim, that once this ritual cycle was complete, the building or institution could host an intelligence of intent. Not demonic, not divine, something else, something old. The Blackwells began experimenting on a small scale: rural churches, isolated colleges, fraternal lodges. They embedded their rites quietly: strange architectural patterns, hidden scripts under floorboards, sacred geometry carved into beams. And over time, witnesses began to speak of buildings that whispered, of deans who changed overnight, of sermons that induced blackouts in pews. One such case was Cambridge Seminary, founded in 1857 in Kentucky. A place of pure moral development? It was actually the first successful site possession experiment. Faculty members began dying one by one, each death accompanied by fire alarms that no system had triggered. Survivors reported hearing their own thoughts spoken aloud by the walls. The final headmaster locked himself in the bell tower and wrote in his own blood, "The school has eaten me." The Blackwells disavowed involvement, then quietly bought the land. But this wasn't just madness. This was proof. Over time, they infiltrated larger targets: Ivy League campuses, state courts, federal archives. Institutions where belief, faith, logic, or law held power over the many. And they installed possession rights with every renovation contract, every cornerstone ceremony, every buried time capsule containing more than just coins and prayers. You think a building can't want something? Walk into certain courtrooms. Stand in the center of certain university quads. Why do your thoughts dim? Why does your resolve collapse? Because the Blackwells wrote the code, and the building obeys. They believed man could be programmed through religion, but society could be enslaved through the buildings that hosted it. Power doesn't come from votes. It never did. It comes from consent sealed in blood, and the Rawlings family made sure every drop was accounted for. They called it the covenant, not a law, not a pact, but something far older. A binding system of sigils, blood rights, and sacred numerology that would encode authority not in words but in flesh. To the public, the Rawlings were lawyers, advisors, kingmakers. But behind closed doors, they were biological notaries of empire. They didn't care who was elected. They cared only that each official passed through their rite, a quiet ritual in a windowless room, with a small prick of the thumb and a paper no one could read. They kept records, thousands of them. Blood cards, signed with arcane stamps, catalogued into what was called the Red Registry. It began in 1789. A month after George Washington's inauguration, a private ceremony was held beneath Federal Hall. 5 men attended. One of them was Tobias Rawlings, an English ritualist with expertise in hereditary sigilcraft, a forgotten science that claimed a person's blood could carry governmental memory. They believed that if you knew how to read the blood of the powerful, you could predict their choices, or worse, preload them. Tobias convinced them to begin the registry. Every president, every senator, every Supreme Court justice since then, catalogued, indexed, bound. This wasn't superstition, it was system, a literal blood network. Each sigil placed into a central array carved beneath the Capitol Rotunda. That array, known only to certain archivists as the Sovereign Seal, acts as a collective tuning fork. It vibrates with ritual cycles. Every time legislation passes, it echoes through the array. But here's the horrifying part: certain names never rotate out. Even after death, some officials' blood sigils are still active in the system. Their decisions, their influence, their will persist. How? Because the Rawlings developed a theory called chronosanguinity, the belief that blood can carry temporal authority, lasting beyond a person's life. That's why some laws seem impossible to repeal. You're not fighting an idea. You're fighting the living imprint of a dead will. You feel it, don't you? That sense that politics is theater. That no matter who wins, the system feels the same. That's because it is. And the Rawlings still sit at the table. Their descendants advise transition teams, chair judicial review panels, and run private genealogy firms for elite clientele. And when a new president is elected, the first person they meet isn't a security advisor. It's the keeper of the seal. You still think freedom is a vote. There are places you'll never find on a map. Towns that existed, had names, zip codes, school mascots, churches, and then one day nothing. Not a fire, not an earthquake, not a mass migration. Just gone. What happened to them? They were enclosed. And the family behind it, the Halversons, you've likely never heard of them. That's intentional, because the Halversons were never meant to be remembered. They were designated forgetters, tasked with a sacred responsibility. When a population became unstable, unpredictable, or self-aware, seal it, contain it, harvest the residue. They called it identity echoing, the process of extracting ambient human signatures from environments steeped in memory, trauma, routine. The belief was that every town developed a psychic imprint shaped by its people, which could be recorded and replicated elsewhere, to engineer compliant societies from scratch. Sound insane? Let me tell you about Briar Ridge, Utah. Founded in 1920 mining town, Pop. 3600. Nothing remarkable until 1956, when reports emerged of synchronized dreaming. Entire households, unrelated, claiming to see the same images: obsidian churches, faceless judges, endless stairs. The town priest called it a psychic infection. He tried to warn the diocese. 1 month later, he vanished, and the Halversons arrived. Within 48 hours, rail lines were shut down. Mail stopped. All phone lines were routed to a technical service center that didn't exist. The town was sealed. Surrounding counties were told it was a chemical spill. But insiders later leaked photographs, long exposure images of black towers erected overnight, lined with spiraled metal. These were resonance pylons designed to record emotional frequency. The Halversons weren't erasing Briar Ridge, they were recording its soul. And then came the replicas. In 1962, a new community appeared in Montana. Same layout, same number of residents, same architecture, same school curriculum. But none of the original Briar Ridge inhabitants were ever found. You still think your town is yours. Think about that strange out-of-place building, that park no one uses, that face you swear you've seen in 2 places at once. You're not imagining it. You're standing in a copy, a behavioral template. Because if the Halversons decided your community had useful compliance patterns, It was harvested, not destroyed, duplicated. And every time someone breaks the pattern, tries to rebel, think, question, those same pylons hum quietly beneath your feet. Still doubt it? Ask why Google Maps blurs a 22-acre stretch outside Kanab, Utah. Ask why census data from 1956 lists Briar Ridge as both active and dissolved. You ever walk into a room you've never been in and suddenly feel rage, sadness, a choking, inexplicable dread? That's not your emotion, it's the room's. Because emotions can be engineered, and the Lockwood family mastered that dark craft over 6 generations. Their secret: emotive resonant architecture. It wasn't just about walls or layout. It was about shaping the soul of a space to alter the state of the people within it. Control not just how they moved, but what they felt, what they feared, what they obeyed. The Lockwoods were no ordinary family. Their bloodline traces back to Thomas Lockwood, a colonial architect who designed churches in New England with ceilings that breathed. Not figuratively. They actually inhaled and exhaled in sync with congregational chanting. Parishioners would report visions. A sacred rapture, they said. But others, especially dissenters, would feel crushing guilt and break down in tears. That wasn't God. That was Lockwood geometry. Fast forward to 1930. Caleb Lockwood, a direct descendant, patents a psychotronic threshold framework. The patent was quietly purchased by a private intelligence firm, later absorbed by a defense contractor that no longer exists on paper. You know what that invention became? Courtrooms, prisons, DMV offices, psychiatric wards. You think it's a coincidence that all these spaces feel the same. Flat fluorescent lighting, echo chambers of concrete, narrow sightlines. That wasn't a design flaw. That was the Lockwood mechanism in action. It's why some buildings suppress rebellion. Others heighten obedience. Some produce guilt, shame, even suicidal ideation in individuals who enter with a certain cognitive signature. The Lockwoods built with intentional resonance, embedding invisible energy matrices into structure, and their most powerful design, a small hexagonal chamber known as the dormitorium. Only 18 were built in America. They were used in black site interrogations, cult initiations, and elite political gatherings. It's said that 20 minutes inside the dormitorium could completely rewrite your sense of time, loyalty, and truth. Now here's the kicker. 3 Lockwood descendants work for major urban planning boards in Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago. They're redesigning public housing, juvenile facilities, and new rehabilitation parks. But they're not correcting poverty. They're cementing psychic submission. So next time you step into a place and your chest tightens, your eyes water, your thoughts scatter, ask yourself, who built this? Why does this room hate me? And what have the Lockwoods encoded into the walls you now call home? Have you ever wondered why some families seem to fall into ruin generation after generation, despite wealth, privilege, and elite connections? Why one son overdoses, the next ends up institutionalized, and the third simply vanishes? It's not coincidence. It's not bad luck. It's ritualized trauma looping. And the Worthington family perfected it. They called it the Protocol of Descent, a hidden system designed to encode bloodline loyalty, not through love or values, but through controlled devastation. The idea was simple, brutal, and effective. Control the soul of the hair by making them bleed where the ancestor bled. Every Worthington male was required to undergo a recalibration. On their 14th birthday, taken to the ancestral estate in New Hampshire, the location was known as the Hollow Seat, a place of eerie silence, animal stillness, and air so thick with grief it was said to crack the lungs. There, they were made to endure a series of emotional, physical, and psychological torments, each tailored to match the documented suffering of a prior Worthington. If an ancestor had drowned in despair, the child was submerged in icy water until visions began. If another had been burned in scandal, the child's secrets were extracted under intense light, recorded, and used as lifelong leverage. These weren't punishments, they were initiations. A system designed to synchronize DNA memory through fear. See, the Worthingtons believed in a forbidden theory: inherited emotional frequency. That trauma could be passed down not just through behavior or environment, but encoded into cellular consciousness. They believed that by recreating that trauma in controlled conditions, they could reactivate the original power of the bloodline. Not heal it, bind it. This is why no Worthington hair could leave. Those who tried to flee the family name were tracked down, rehabilitated, or disappeared. One branch of the tree even became whistleblowers, until their entire mansion mysteriously collapsed in a sinkhole the day before court testimony. And if you think this practice died in the 1900s, think again. The modern Worthingtons have rebranded the protocol. It now exists within transformative leadership retreats, ancestral healing camps, and elite youth mentorship programs across Ivy League institutions. They still loop pain, but now they sell it as empowerment. And now I ask you, what if your suffering isn't random? What if you're just playing out the script someone long dead handed down to you? What if the trauma you feel was installed? Deep in the cold woods of Idaho, hidden behind miles of restricted land and a labyrinth of legal loopholes, there once stood a place whispered about in academia, but officially denied in every document that matters. It was known only as the Severin Enclosure. Not a school, not a lab, not a cult. It was something worse, a prototype for psychological containment. A human simulation chamber designed to test what happens when you remove reality itself from a child's mind. 7 siblings, born between 1974 and 1982, raised to believe they were the last human beings on Earth. From the moment they could walk, they were told the world had ended in a chemical apocalypse. That the outside would melt their skin, that other people, if seen, were genetically cursed phantoms, soulless remnants of a war-torn species. They were shown fabricated news broadcasts, fed historical timelines where America had perished in fire, and every few weeks they would hear a low, humming siren echo through the enclosure, signaling mutant activity beyond the gates. But it was all a lie. Outside the compound, normal towns, healthy forests, a team of rotating psychologists and sociologists observing the siblings' descent from hidden chambers built behind two-way mirrors and false walls. Government-backed, privately funded, an experimental crucible in synthetic identity programming. By age 10, the youngest sibling began hearing voices in the walls, whispers that told her to dig beneath the garden. There, she uncovered a buried speaker and pieces of electrical wire. The illusion cracked, but the reaction from the observers, even colder. Rather than remove the children or admit fault, they recalibrated the protocol, introduced a new storyline, that the child had been infected by a reality virus planted by the phantoms. She was isolated from her siblings for 8 months, during which her diary shifted from drawings of family meals to frantic scripts of names I've never heard but can't stop dreaming about. Names of real people. From the outside world, some of them alive, some of them missing. It was this collapse, this glitch in the simulation, that led to the program's quiet shutdown in 1991. Or so they claimed. But what if I told you the enclosure didn't close? It replicated. What began as a family became a formula. Today, digital versions of the Severin protocol live inside algorithmic echo chambers, where you're raised to believe you're the last sane mind in a world gone mad. Where dissent is infection, and where questioning the story is how you get exiled from the only truth you've ever known. Still think this is history? Look around. Welcome to the new enclosure. By the time the public learned of the Llewellyn Testament, the damage had already been done. But most didn't even realize what they were reading. Because this wasn't a letter. It wasn't a confession. It was a weaponized book. In 1893, Archibald Llewellyn, heir to a vast railroad empire stretching from Pennsylvania to Colorado, authored a seemingly innocent collection of stories titled The Path of the Suns. It was released under a pen name. No one knew it was from one of the wealthiest men in America. No one knew it was never meant for you. Only the first edition, printed in a run of 2,000, contained the original unaltered text. Every copy was sent directly to the sons of elite families across the Northeast, Midwest, and Deep South. Private schools, Masonic lodges, political lineages. The boys were between 7 and 14 years old. Their fathers were judges, industrialists, and clergymen. The book disguised itself as a parable, filled coming-of-age tale, but embedded in its structure were repetition devices, linguistic loops engineered through poetic rhythm, trauma symbolism, and embedded phonetic commands. Read once. It was strange. Read twice. It stayed in your memory. Read it aloud at night, as instructed in the final chapter, and something began to happen. Sleepwalking, changes in handwriting, sudden interest in family property rights, jurisdictional language, and historical bloodlines. Within 2 years, several children who had read the book, according to journals later recovered, began to use words they'd never been taught. Words like imperial covenant, latent right, ancestral guardianship, terms traced back to 16th century grimoire law, the kind only found in banned books from Scottish occult libraries and hidden Jesuit monasteries. What Archibald had created was a codex of control, designed to embed ideological programs in children's subconscious long before they could consent. By the time they inherited the family wealth, the command was already in place: protect the blood, obey the testament, expand the order. Generational wealth wasn't just secured through law. It was encrypted in language. But here's where it fractures. In 1948, a librarian at Dartmouth named Charles Winfield uncovered one of the original copies. He noticed oddities in the typography, certain letters slightly off-center, specific phrases that appeared every 33 pages precisely. He cross-referenced it with encryption manuals from World War II and uncovered a cipher grid. When decoded, it spelled out a series of phrases. He who does not obey the phrase shall lose his voice. To forget the line is to dissolve the line. The order preserves itself. Shortly after sharing these findings with a peer at Yale, Winfield died. Natural causes. No autopsy. His house caught fire the same week. The book vanished. But fragments still exist, hidden in children's readers, private school curricula, and rare auction books that look like simple fairy tales, but act like subconscious scripts. And if you're wondering how such a technique could be used today, look closely at the children's media produced by billion-dollar studios. Look at the rhymes, the repetition, the phrases your kids chant without knowing why. It was never just a book. It was a spell of succession. In the winter of 1932, beneath the crystalline chandeliers of the Brighton Club in New York City, a meeting took place that no history book dares mention. The attendees were not presidents or generals. They were kingmakers, quietly richer than nations. On the guest list, George Brighton, heir to shipping monopolies in the Atlantic corridor; Harold Murrow, whose pharmaceutical empire had wormed its way into U.S. Army medical contracts; and 11 unnamed delegates, whose families have been buried beneath layers of fake surnames and sealed archives. It was called the Concordance, not a treaty, not a business deal, a pact. Its aim, not just wealth preservation, but gene curation. You see, the elites of that time were obsessed with lineage engineering. They had watched with fascination and envy as the British eugenics movement took root in academia. They saw how undesirables could be defined, erased, institutionalized. But what the Brighton-Murrow Circle wanted was far more sinister, not to purify the population, but to craft an invisible ruling genotype across American bloodlines. Their plan had two parts. First, preserve and converge elite genes. Through carefully arranged marriages, fertility interventions, and even hidden paternity swaps, they would ensure that specific mental, emotional, and physiological traits stayed within an proved genetic corridor. Not just IQ, but social dominance, trauma resistance, and a chilling ability to disassociate from empathy. Second, quietly phase out counter bloodlines. Those from families deemed unpredictable, rebellious, or too fertile outside protocol were removed from opportunity tracks. Scholarships revoked, loans denied, drafted into wars, medicated in childhood, sterilized through mislabeled treatments, and if they rose too high, their scandals were manufactured, their legacies erased. The mechanism: a network of elite doctors, headmasters, judges, and intelligence contacts, coordinated through what would later become embedded assets in eugenics, friendly think tanks, and educational councils. The Brighton-Murrow truce was sealed with signatures on a single sheet, burned after reading, its terms memorized. What survived was an unspoken code among families: protect the ratio. That is, maintain a 14:9:1 ratio between controlled heirs and rogue births within their circles. And if the ratio slipped, a culling was authorized, economic, social, or biological. One name surfaces again and again in private correspondence from the era: the architect. A man without public record, said to have advised both Brighton and Murrow. No photo, no address, but he left a phrase scribbled in the margin of one surviving letter: the blood must forget it was ever wild. Then it will obey. You might think this is fiction. But tell me, why did so many untimely deaths strike bright, rebellious sons of wealthy families between 1934 and 1941? Why did journals from elite prep schools suddenly ban genealogy research? Why do some family lines vanish from national registries after 3 generations of prominence? And why, to this day, does one particular genetic marker, linked to aggressive intelligence and high resilience, appear almost exclusively in men tied to the Brighton and Murrow bloodlines? There are families you'll never see on Forbes, because they don't need to be rich publicly when they already run the infrastructure of inheritance. They were not born in hospitals, at least, not the kind that report births to the state. In 1951, a covert program known only by the codename Operation Augustine began under the guise of Cold War psychological research. But this wasn't about spies. It was about seedlines, a hidden initiative to create, test, and distribute genetically and psychologically engineered children among elite American families and beyond. The facilities? Underground. Literally, built beneath sanitariums, shuttered military bases, and private properties in West Virginia, New Mexico, and upstate New York. The doctors? Former MK Ultra contributors? Nazi defectors under Project Paperclip? and American psychiatrists who had quietly renounced the Hippocratic oath in service of something far more seductive, designing obedience. These children were referred to as blanks, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they were raised without native emotional bonding. No mothers, no fathers, just handlers' machines, flashing lights, daily correction sessions. Their language development was purposefully delayed, their imagination stunted, and their sense of identity disassembled and rewritten with algorithmic precision. By age 6, they were assigned to surrogate families. Most were implanted in powerful households under the ruse of adoption, fertility surrogacy, or wardship through tragedy. The real children of those families often disappeared, dead in accidents, shipped abroad, institutionalized, and in their place stood the replacements. But these weren't just orphans with forged paperwork. They were psychological templates, each one trained to mirror a specific social role: future senator, media mogul, bishop, CEO. They could mimic empathy, but they didn't feel it. They could simulate charm, but they didn't crave connection. What they did crave was structure, obedience, order, and most of all, dominance. Because these weren't just experiments, they were installations. Think of it like software embedded in the blood. When activated by trauma or power, these blanks transitioned into something else entirely. Men and women who operated not on conscience, but on directive. Self-replicating. Unshakably loyal to the design. Some were aware. Most were not. And if you think this is science fiction, explain this. Why did private boarding schools in the 1960s suddenly receive anonymous children with no records, yet full scholarships? Why did certain political dynasties adopt heirs after their own children? Tragically, died only to rise even higher than their predecessors. And why did dozens of therapists, nurses, and teachers connected to these children either vanish or later commit suicide? You've met some of these blanks. On TV, in boardrooms, in churches. They don't blink the same. They don't flinch the same. They don't fail the same. They were created to be immune to chaos, to guilt, to love, but not to control. And here's the darkest truth. Some of them became parents themselves, which means the next generation isn't just programmed, it's hereditary. Now ask yourself, what would happen if these engineered bloodlines began recognizing each other? And what if they already have? If you've ever seen an ancient crest carved into a fireplace mantel, or a ring passed down from a great uncle no one can trace, then you've brushed the edge of a world that operates on marks, not words. Hidden families, true dynasties, don't identify themselves with last names. They mark territory with sigils, glyphs, geometric lies hiding sacred truths. 4 lineages, 4 seals, all erased from public history by 1897, but whispered in underground circles for decades after. The first was the serpent fork, a symbol resembling an S, split in two by a dagger. It appeared on old banking documents, Masonic meeting ledgers, and was famously etched in the inside binding of a 1796 Bible found in Montauk. The families associated with this mark controlled currency of belief: churches, seminaries, televangelist networks. Their doctrine wasn't salvation. It was submission. Through confession. Through guilt. Through inherited shame. The second, the chain crown. An emblem once sewn into silk linings of judges' robes in Boston, New York, and Savannah. It's a circle of iron links fused into a coronet. These were the legislators behind the legislators. Families like the Idadan and Vidada lines, who arranged the marriages of judges, congressmen, and attorneys like chess pieces. Their power wasn't in rulings. It was in precedent. Quiet legal decisions that outlived every politician who signed them. Third came the spiral flame, almost always misidentified as a Celtic knot or pagan rune. But in truth, it was the insignia of the keepers of the arcane science. Families who funded early psychiatric wards, speech therapy centers, and language reform projects across the U.S. These bloodlines had one goal: control the thought before it becomes the word. They weren't after censorship. They wanted to reshape cognition itself. You don't erase truth by burning books. You erase it by rewriting the mind that would read them. And the fourth, the most elusive, the broken tree, 3 branches cut, 1 left standing. It appears on grave markers with no names, tattooed behind the ears of children in old orphanage records, engraved inside pendants given to military commanders. This symbol wasn't about control, it was about legacy, a family tree deliberately pruned. Its living members have no idea of their ancestry. Or rather, they didn't. But after 1978, the broken tree began to reassemble. Through ritual, through accident, through blood recognition so deep it activates genetic memory. These 4 sigils still appear on architecture, artwork, even in federal insignia you've seen 100 times but never understood. Not because they're dead, but because they're hiding in plain sight. And here's what chills the bone. When these marks appear together, when the serpent fork, chain crown, spiral flame, and broken tree are aligned, ritual convergence is near. A moment where decisions are made that will never be recorded, but will ripple through every institution for generations. You weren't supposed to know this. You were supposed to keep watching, keep obeying. But now, you've seen the signs. And once you've seen the marks, they see you too. You've made it to the edge. Not everyone does. Most turn back. Most hear the whispers, feel the burn behind their eyes, and choose comfort over clarity. But you kept walking, into the fog, into the fire. That tells me one thing. Your blood remembers what your mind was forced to forget. Let me ask you something directly. Do you ever feel watched? Even when you're alone? Have you ever had memories that didn't belong to you? A dream you've had since childhood that never changes, never fades? That's not imagination. That's ancestral coding. A lock placed on your awareness by those who needed you silent. Numb. Blind. You see? These sinister bloodlines didn't just breed power. They bred obedience. Through trauma. Through separation. Through carefully designed forgetting. You may have come from a family that never spoke of its past. Not because there was nothing there, but because the past was too dangerous to name. And now you sit in the aftermath. You've been taught to be docile in the face of deception. Taught to accept surface truths and fear your own instincts. Taught that if you ever pulled the thread too hard, the entire world would collapse. Let it all fall apart. Because here's the real secret: you are not broken. You are the survivor of a long-term, systematic silencing. And the fact that you're still searching, still hungry for what was buried, that makes you a threat. There is power in remembering, power in speaking, power in knowing that the names they erased are still written in your marrow. Right now, I want you to prove to the system that you're waking up. Not to me, to the ones watching from behind the veil. Comment the phrase, "The blood remembers." The blood remembers. Twice, not once. Not for the algorithm, but for the identity shift. Because this is where it begins. From here, you'll start seeing signs differently. Logos won't be just art, they'll be warnings. News won't be information, it will be ritualized propaganda. Conversations with your family will reveal glitches. Symbols will pulse. Music will sting. You'll feel doors open you never noticed before. And with that awareness comes something even darker: choice. You can walk away now, pretend you never saw this, bury it beneath entertainment and comfort. Or you can descend deeper, learn the names, decode the rituals, face the families that shaped the shadows of a nation. But once you see the roots, you can't unsee them. Once you hear the hum beneath the silence, you can't go back to sleep. The question is, will you carry the blood forward, or let the tree die again? Your inheritance has been waiting. Now claim it.